The herd grew enormous, and the bones in the pasture didn't belong to cattle. In 1897, in the desolate Texas Panhandle, Jeremiah Walker made a horrifying choice that would forever alter his fate. A ranch hand struggling to survive, he fed his cattle human flesh, starting with a lone traveler passing through his land. But as the herd grew larger, so did the terrifying discovery. The bones scattered across the pasture weren't from cattle. They were human. The land, hungry and relentless, had called to him, urging him deeper into madness. What happened next was more than a simple tale of survival. It was a descent into something far darker, where the line between man and monster blurred beyond recognition. Jeremiah Walker arrived in the Texas Panhandle with only the clothes on his back and a heart heavy with the weight of the past. He had heard stories about the wild, desolate land, about how it could swallow a man whole, leaving only his ghost behind. Had chosen this life, a fresh start, far from the prying eyes of a world that had forgotten him. The land stretched out before him, endless, unforgiving, but it was his now, and it felt like freedom, at least at first. His days were simple, building fences, checking the herd, fixing things that seemed to break when he wasn't looking. The isolation, for the moment, was peaceful. The wind howled through the wide open spaces, and the only sound was the lowing of the cattle, his cattle. He had started with a small group, nothing extravagant, just enough to get by. But something about the land felt strange, something alive. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it was there, like a weight in the air. Days turned to weeks, and the herd began to grow at an unnatural rate. Jeremiah wasn't sure how it happened, and he wasn't even sure when it began. One day, there were just a few. The next, the pasture was teeming with cattle. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. At first, he told himself it was just good luck. After all, this was the West. Cattle were valuable, and his herd was thriving. But as he counted the animals, something gnawed at him. The herd was too large, far larger than a man could manage alone. They were thriving, yes, but why? Jeremiah had heard stories about the land, the curses, the bad luck. He had dismissed them as superstition, but now, standing there in the midst of the enormous herd, it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that something was amiss. The cattle didn't just grow, they flourished, and every time he checked on them, they seemed to have grown even larger, as if the land itself was feeding them, urging them to thrive. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty ground, Jeremiah made his way out to the farthest corner of the pasture. The cattle were grazing peacefully, their dark silhouettes scattered across the land. The wind kicked up, swirling dust around his boots. It was then he noticed it. The earth was disturbed in places, uneven, as though someone had been digging. His heart skipped a beat. He approached cautiously, the unease building like a storm in his chest. As he reached the edge of the pasture, he saw it, a hole, half covered with dirt and debris, and beneath it bones, human bones. Jeremiah stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. There were bones, and they weren't cattle bones. They were unmistakably human. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These bones hadn't been buried by time or nature. They had been buried by someone, deliberately left there like discarded trash. His thoughts raced. Who had been here before him? What had happened to them? He knelt down, touching the bones with trembling hands. They were old, weathered by the elements, but still disturbingly fresh in the way they felt still, sharp enough to make his skin crawl. He stood back up, scanning the area around him. The wind picked up again, this time louder, more insistent, as if urging him to look deeper. He stared out at the horizon. The land felt hungry. The cattle were growing, and now he was finding human remains. It wasn't a coincidence. There was something wrong with this place, something unnatural. His pulse quickened. But what did it mean? What did it want from him? The next morning, Jeremiah rode out to check the herd again. His mind was racing. The image of the bones burned into his thoughts. Every time he tried to shake the feeling of something wrong, it returned stronger, deeper, more urgent. As he walked through the pasture, something caught his eye. It wasn't much, just a flicker of movement in the distance, a figure standing still, watching him. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone, or was he? Jeremiah approached cautiously, eyes narrowing. The figure, if it was a figure at all, disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He was sure had seen something. Someone had been watching him, hidden in the distance, like a shadow in the landscape. He scanned the land again, his heart pounding. Nothing. What the hell was going on? The unease was turning into something darker now. It was becoming a presence. He could feel it, like the land itself was watching him, as if it was breathing, waiting. And the cattle, they weren't just cattle anymore. They were different. Their eyes, when they looked at him, held something that wasn't quite right. He rode back to the ranch, unable to shake the feeling that the land had its claws in him. But what did it want? Why the bones? Why the cattle? Why him? That night, as he sat alone in his cabin, trying to drown out the fear gnawing at his insides, he heard it. A low whisper, faint at first, like the wind, but then it grew clearer, more distinct. "Feed them," it seemed to say. "Feed them." Jeremiah froze. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the cabin, and the cattle seemed to stir restlessly in the distance, their lowing carrying in the night air. He couldn't tell if he was losing his mind or if the land itself was speaking to him, urging him to feed the herd. The hunger, the undeniable urge to feed them, started to gnaw at him again. But this wasn't just hunger for food. It was a deeper, darker hunger. The land wanted him to feed the cattle, and in return, it would give them strength, power. The thought crossed his mind, what if I fed them something more? His body felt cold. The whispering in his mind grew louder, more demanding. Something else had been here before him, something just as desperate. Had it led to this? Was he part of the same cycle? The bones, the whispers, the cattle. The land was hungry, and now so was he. But Jeremiah wasn't the only one with a hunger to feed. The land's appetite was far darker than he could ever have imagined, and soon he would find out what it demanded in return. Days dragged on as the whispering voices in Jeremiah's head grew louder, more insistent. The ranch was beginning to feel less like a home and more like a prison. He could shake the feeling that the land was suffocating him, demanding something from him, and the cattle, their eyes, glowing eerily in the twilight, seemed to stare right into his soul. His supplies were running low. The food was almost gone, and the next town was days away by horseback. His stomach churned with hunger, but it wasn't just a normal hunger, it was a need, an aching, gnawing feeling deep inside him. He could feel the land pulling at him, urging him to act. He couldn't wait for supplies anymore. The land had already started to take what it needed from him. He had seen the bones, heard the whispers, and now it wanted more. Jeremiah had been alone long enough to start thinking in ways that terrified him. The herd, once a mere group of cattle, had grown into something almost monstrous. They were bigger, stronger, their eyes darker with every passing day. They weren't just feeding, they were growing, becoming more. The land was feeding them, and it was feeding him too. The cattle were thriving, but Jeremiah, he was wasting away. For days, his thoughts had been consumed by one question: what if? What if he could feed them something more? What if the land needed something more than cattle to satisfy its hunger? The idea felt wrong, but at the same time, it felt inevitable. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the pasture, Jeremiah stood at the edge of the land, gazing out at the cattle. His thoughts were racing. His body ached. The hunger inside him was unbearable. He turned, walking back toward the cabin. His boots dragged in the dirt, each step heavy with dread. He couldn't stop thinking about the bones he had found, about the way they had been buried, as though they had been placed there deliberately, as if they were a warning. His mind wandered back to the whisper in the wind. Feed them. But what was it asking for? What had the land been feeding on all this time? The shadows in the distance shifted, and for a moment, Jeremiah thought he saw a figure, a shadow, hidden among the trees, a figure that wasn't there a moment ago. His heart skipped a beat. He squinted into the twilight, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But the moment he looked away, the figure vanished. The wind picked up again, sending chills down his spine. His thoughts snapped back to the hunger, to the voice that had been growing louder in his mind. It was his hunger now. His thoughts weren't his own anymore. They had become tangled with the land's demands. He was becoming something else, something darker. That night, unable to sleep, Jeremiah wandered outside. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. He stood by the pasture gate, staring at the herd. They were quiet, but there was a tension in the air. The cattle shifted restlessly, as if they too were waiting for something. Suddenly, the whisper came again. Feed them. His heart raced. It wasn't a voice he could hear with his ears, it was a thought, an overwhelming compulsion. The land was speaking to him, feeding him this hunger, this need. He felt as though he was being pulled toward the cattle. He stepped forward, his feet carrying him toward them, the sound of his boots crunching on the dry earth. As he walked, he became aware of the weight of the decision he was about to make. He could feel the land closing in around him, suffocating him, pressing him to act. He wasn't sure if he was acting out of necessity or madness, but the decision was already made. Jeremiah grabbed his rifle, his hands shaking, and made his way to the barn where he kept his tools. He was only half aware of what he was doing. I was lost in the fog of his thoughts, consumed by a dark hunger he didn't fully understand. The need to feed them overpowered everything else. When he returned to the pasture, he found his first victim, a lone traveler, a man who had been passing through. Jeremiah had noticed him a few days earlier, but the man hadn't come near the ranch until now. He had no way of knowing that this was part of the land's plan, that he was the next offering. The traveler was camped by a fire near the edge of the pasture. His back was turned, and Jeremiah could hear him humming softly to himself. The shadows stretched across the ground, creating an eerie silence. Jeremiah moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was louder now. The land was calling for him to act. He didn't hesitate. The rifle cracked like thunder in the quiet night. The man collapsed, his body falling forward, the life draining from him. Jeremiah stood over him, looking down at the body he had just taken. There was no time to second-guess himself. The hunger, the need was all-consuming. He dragged the body to the pasture. The cattle gathered around, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight, their lowing turning into something almost animalistic, frantic. The herd didn't just feed. They devoured, tearing into the flesh as though it was the only thing that mattered. Jeremiah watched, entranced, as the cattle gorged themselves. The hunger was satiated, for now. But it wasn't just the cattle feeding. Jeremiah felt the land feeding on him too. The hunger in his belly, the gnawing ache, faded. He felt a surge of energy, a rush of warmth filling his veins. The land was feeding him, just as it had fed the cattle. And for the first time since he had come to this cursed place, he didn't feel weak. He felt stronger. But this was just the beginning of his nightmare. The cattle grew larger, more aggressive. Their eyes darkened. The land seemed to stretch, its reach further into his soul. He could feel it now was a part of it. The land had claimed him, and he had become its tool. Jeremiah's mind cracked. The voice in his head grew louder, more demanding. Feed them. It wasn't just the cattle anymore. The land had begun to speak to him in ways he couldn't escape. He was a prisoner to it now, and soon he would realize just how far he had fallen. But what he didn't know was that feeding the land would not only change him, it would bring about horrors he could never imagine. And the cattle, they were only the beginning. Jeremiah stood in the silence of the night, the heavy scent of blood still hanging in the air. The cattle, their bellies full, began to scatter back into the pasture. Their eyes gleamed with an unnatural hunger as they moved like shadows, their lowing soft and distant. The moon was high now, its pale light casting long shadows across the land. But for all its beauty, it felt cold, suffocating, like a veil over a nightmare that was about to unfold. Jeremiah could still hear the echoes of the rifle shot in his head, the sudden brutal violence of it. The man's body, lying lifeless in the dirt, felt like a memory that didn't belong to him. The hunger had driven him to do it, but now that it was over, he could feel a growing emptiness inside. What had he become? What had he just done? He shook his head, trying to shake off the weight of the guilt that gnawed at him. But the land was pulling him, its presence becoming harder to ignore. He had fed the cattle, he had fed them human flesh, and in return, he felt stronger. His hand trembled slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The hunger had dulled, but it hadn't disappeared. In its place, there was a creeping sense of wrongness that seemed to seep into his very bones. Jeremiah had never believed in curses, never thought of the old tales the cowboys had whispered around the campfire about the land, about the men who came before him. But now, he wasn't so sure. Had heard the whispers before, faint at first, but now they were louder. They were calling to him, demanding more. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like 1,000 voices at once. It was a scream, a wail that tore through the quiet night and sent chills down his spine. It felt like the earth itself was alive, waiting, watching. He spun around, his heart racing. It was as though the land had become a living thing, breathing and hungry, its pulse quickening with every breath he took. The cattle, once docile, now moved with purpose, their eyes fixated on him as though they could sense his every thought. It was happening again. The land was feeding on him, just like it had fed on the cattle. Jeremiah's feet carried him back toward the barn, his mind a blur. His hand grasped the handle of his rifle instinctively, but it wasn't the gun he wanted. It was answers. He needed to know why this was happening, why the bones had been buried in the earth, why the cattle had grown so fast, so unnaturally. He had to know if there was more to this land than he could understand, if the whispers, the hunger, were all part of something bigger, something darker. Inside the barn, his eyes fell upon an old, weathered crate. It was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. He didn't remember seeing it before, and yet, here it was, sitting in the corner of the barn like it had always been there, waiting. Jeremiah stepped forward. the sound of his boots creaking against the wooden floor. The whispers were now louder than ever, clawing at his mind, pushing him to open the crate. He wiped his hands on his pants, the tension building inside his chest. What was he doing? What was in that crate? Was he ready to know? His hand gripped the latch, and with a deep breath, he yanked it open. Inside, he found a collection of journals sold, yellowed, brittle with age. They were stacked haphazardly, pages, falling out from years of neglect. His fingers shook as he picked up the first one. The leather cover cracked and worn. He flipped through the pages, the handwriting scrawled in a frantic, almost desperate script. The entries were disjointed, fevered. The ranch hand who had written these journals had clearly gone mad, and as Jeremiah read, a chill crept down his spine. The journals spoke of a similar descent into madness, a story that mirrored his own. The previous ranch hand had arrived alone, just as Jeremiah had. He had seen the bones too, but what the man had discovered, what he had written about, was far worse. The land, the cattle, the hunger, it was all tied together. The ranch hand described a curse, a force older than the earth itself, a force that had claimed him just as it was claiming Jeremiah now. The man spoke of the voices off the land calling to him, demanding more. He had slaughtered cattle at first just to feed himself, but the more he fed them, the more alive the land became. The more the cattle grew, the hungrier they became. And the bones? The ranch hand had written about them in detail. They weren't just a sign of death, they were a warning. The land demanded sacrifices, and once you fed it, there was no going back. Jeremiah's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The journals grew darker, more erratic as the entries went on. The ranch hand had become convinced that the land itself was alive, that it had claimed him just as it had claimed those before him. He had been driven to feed it, until it took everything from him. And then, the final entry, the last one, written in what could only be described as frantic terror. They told me to feed them. I did. Now they want more. They won't stop. I can hear them. They're coming for me. The land has me. The cattle the entry ended abruptly, the last words trailing off into nothing. Jeremiah's stomach churned. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he slammed the journal shut. It was happening again. The cycle was repeating itself. The land had claimed him. It had started with the bones, with the whispers. It had fed him, and now it was time for him to feed it again. But this time, it wouldn't stop. The land needed more, and it would never be satisfied. Jeremiah staggered backward, his mind reeling. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. The land had already consumed him, body and soul. As he stumbled outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in a sickly red glow. The cattle were waiting, standing still in the pasture, their eyes fixed on him with an unsettling, almost knowing intensity. They were hungry. Jeremiah turned, his legs heavy beneath him. The weight of the decision was unbearable. There was no escaping it now. He had fed them once. He would have to feed them again. The land was demanding it. The hunger wouldn't stop until he did. He took one last look at the herd, his mind screaming, but his body betraying him. He felt the pull of the land, the need to obey. And so, with his heart heavy and his soul sinking into the void, he walked toward the cattle, the whispers echoing in his mind. But the land was never finished with him. It wasn't just the cattle that would feed on him soon. He would learn that the hunger of the earth itself had only just begun. The night was thick with tension, suffocating, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jeremiah stood in the moonlight, staring out at the herd that had grown far beyond anything he could control. His fingers trembled as they clutched the worn handle of his rifle. The whispers in his mind were louder now, as if the land itself was speaking through them, commanding him, urging him to take that final step. He had been hearing it for days, that voice. It was impossible to ignore. Feed them. The words echoed through his mind, gnawing at his sanity. The hunger wasn't just his anymore, it was the land's, the cattle's, the earth's. It had wrapped its claws around his soul, and now it was pulling him deeper, further into its grip. Jeremiah's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced back at the cabin, his only refuge from the growing madness. He had tried to push the thoughts away. He had tried to pretend that the whispers were just the wind, just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. But every time he closed his eyes, their hunger was all he could feel. The cattle had grown too large, too fast. They were no longer simple animals. They were creatures of something darker, something that lived and breathed with the land's will. He could no longer deny it. He wasn't just feeding the cattle anymore. He was feeding the land, feeding the curse that had claimed him. The wind howled again, but this time it was different. It was a low, guttural growl, like the land itself was in pain, calling out for something. His stomach twisted and his breath hitched in his throat. His eyes shifted to the cattle gathered in the distance, their eyes glimmering in the moonlight, focused solely on him. They were waiting, just as he was, waiting for him to make the choice. Jeremiah took a step forward, and another, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth, his breath caught in his throat. The cattle had already begun to stir, moving toward him like a slow-moving tide of flesh. The closer they got, the more he felt the pull, the need. He knew what the land wanted. He had always known. He couldn't keep running from it. He was already too deep in the cycle. The hunger was part of him now. The urge to feed them was overwhelming, consuming. He reached for his rifle again, feeling the weight of it in his hands, the cold metal heavy against his palm. What choice did he have? The whispers weren't just his thoughts, they were the land's, and the land demanded. And then, as if answering some unspoken question, a figure appeared out of the dark, another wanderer, another soul passing through, lost in the vastness of the desert. Jeremiah froze. The man was young, unarmed, carrying nothing more than the clothes on his back. He must have been traveling for days, looking for shelter, for something. Jeremiah's chest tightened. The man's presence felt like an omen, as if the land itself had brought him here to fulfill its hunger. The cattle were closer now, restless, snorting, their eyes fixed on the man, then back on Jeremiah. He had the rifle in his hands, but his mind was a whirlwind. The land had been pushing him toward this moment. Now was the time. His heart raced as the man approached, unaware of the terror that waited for him. Jeremiah's pulse quickened with every step the man took toward the herd. He knew what he had to do. He didn't want to do it, but it was as if the land had already made the decision for him. His hand was moving before he could think. The rifle cracked in the night, its shot echoing through the stillness of the land. The man's body crumpled to the ground instantly. Jeremiah stood there, his eyes wide, his breath ragged. For a moment, there was silencious stillness in the air as the reality of what he had done settled in. He had killed him. The man lay there, motionless, his life snuffed out in an instant. Jeremiah stared at the body, his mind spinning, unable to comprehend what he had just done. But the cattle didn't care. The herd had already started moving toward the body, their eyes burning with a terrifying hunger. They didn't hesitate, they were starving. They surrounded the body, their lowing filling the air like a chorus of demons. And as they began to feast, tearing into the flesh, the land seemed to breathe with them, a deep, unsettling rumble that shook the ground beneath Jeremiah's feet. His stomach churned as he watched the cattle feed, their monstrous forms illuminated by the pale moonlight. They tore into the body with a ferocity he couldn't understand, their movements fast and brutal. Jeremiah was no longer sure if he was watching the cattle feed or if he was watching something else, something dark feeding on the land's curse. The land had claimed him, and now it had claimed the man too. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling his mind. Feed them. The voice didn't feel like his own anymore, it felt like the land's. The hunger wasn't his anymore. He had given it away. The cattle, the land, they were alive with it, consuming everything in their path. The more he fed them, the more they grew. And soon he would realize there would be nothing left to give. The world felt like it was spinning. The land had swallowed him whole, and now it was swallowing the man too. He wasn't sure if he was the one in control anymore, or if he was just a part of the cycle, a tool of the land's hunger. But then, a sound broke through the chaos, the wind howling in his ears, louder than before, like a warning. Jeremiah's eyes snapped back to the body. The cattle had consumed it almost completely, but there was something left, something wrong. The bones, they hadn't been eaten. The body had been torn apart, but the bones had been left untouched. Jeremiah stepped closer, his feet unsteady beneath him, his stomach twisted with dread as he knelt down, his fingers brushing the remains of the body. The bones were wrong. They weren't human. The bone structure was off, twisted. As his fingers touched the ribs, a faint crack echoed in the stillness. The bones were shifting, changing, and then the ground trembled beneath his feet. Something else was rising. The cattle were no longer the only things feeding on the land. The bones were beginning to stir, pulling themselves from the earth, as though the land was pulling them back. They were becoming something new, something alive. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the earth beneath him shook again, this time harder. Something was awakening, something he couldn't yet understand. The cattle were growing larger, but they weren't the only things growing. Jeremiah stepped back, his mind spinning. The land had claimed him, and it was never going to stop. The hunger wouldn't stop. But as the land's curse rose around him, he would learn that he wasn't the only one it had claimed. The true horror of the cycle would be revealed. The bones were rising, and with them came a darkness far greater than he ever imagined. Jeremiah had seen enough to know that something was deeply wrong. The land, the cattle, the bone sit was all connected. and no matter how hard he tried to run from it, the whispers never stopped. They filled his mind, day and night, gnawing at his thoughts, demanding more. "Feed them," the voice would say. "They hunger." And the hunger, it wasn't just physical anymore. It was in his bones. His very soul had become a part of the land, twisted by the curse he could never escape. The cattle had grown too strong, too large. But the land's hunger was growing faster, more relentless. It didn't want just flesh, it wanted everything. His sanity, his will, his soul. The bones that had risen from the earth had become something else, something that should never have been. They weren't just the remains of the man who had fallen to the land's curse, they had transformed. Twisted, malformed skeletons were now scattered across the field, half buried in the dirt, twitching with unnatural life. They weren't dead anymore. They had risen. The cattle, monstrous and grotesque, continued to feast. Their bodies had grown larger, impossibly so. They moved with a chilling purpose now, as if they had an intelligence all their own. Their eyes locked onto Jeremiah's with a knowing, dark gaze. They weren't just animals anymore. The land had made them something else, something far darker. The hunger was more than just physical need, it was a disease, a force that consumed everything in its path. Jeremiah staggered back from the herd, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands shook. The land was pushing him, pulling him. It wasn't just the cattle that needed to feed, it was him. He couldn't stand to look at them anymore. He couldn't even stand to look at the bones half buried in the dirt, their twisted forms rising slowly from the earth as if they were reborn into something even darker. The whispers told him to keep feeding them, but Jeremiah didn't know if he could anymore. The guilt was consuming him, but he was powerless. He felt it now, the weight of his own choices, the terrible cost of the land's curse. It was inescapable, and it was growing stronger by the day. He was losing himself to it, losing his mind, his humanity, and his soul. He wasn't sure where the land began and he ended anymore. Jeremiah's grip on reality was slipping, the line between nightmare and waking life blurring until there was no distinction. The cattle no longer grazed peacefully, they stalked him, their movements predatory. They knew what he had done, they wanted more. But there was another hunger, a deeper hunger now. It wasn't just the cattle he had to feed, it was the land itself, and the land was demanding more than he could give. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm, piercing his thoughts, invading his every waking moment. That night, under the light of a blood-red moon, Jeremiah heard something that made his blood run cold, a voice that wasn't his own, a voice that spoke directly to him. It was deep, guttural, and full of malice. "You have fed them. Now you will feed the land." Jeremiah dropped to his knees, the weight of the words crashing down on him. The land was no longer asking for sacrifices, it was commanding them. He was a part of it now, a mere tool to fulfill its insatiable hunger. The cattle, the bones, the landed was all part of the same cycle, a cycle of consumption, of death and rebirth. The voice spoke again, louder this time, and this time there was no mistaking it. Feed them, all. Jeremiah staggered to his feet, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't do this. He couldn't be the one to keep feeding it, to keep feeding the land's curse. But there was no escaping it. He felt the land tugging at him, pulling him back toward the herd, back toward the hunger. But this time, something was different. The bones, those twisted, malformed skeletons were no longer just lifeless remains. They were standing, they were moving. They had become alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Their empty eyes locked onto Jeremiah's, and he knew without a doubt that they were watching him. They were waiting. Jeremiah's legs felt like lead as he stumbled back, the whispers in his mind growing louder, more frantic. He had to stop this. He had to end it. But then, as if summoned by his panic, the cattle closed in around him. They had grown so large that they filled the entire pasture, their monstrous forms blotting out the sky. The land was calling them, and they were listening. They were no longer just animals, they were vessels, carrying out the will of the land. Jeremiah's chest tightened, the air thick with fear and desperation. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and he could feel the bones, the land's bones shifting beneath the earth. It wasn't just the cattle that needed to feed. The land needed him. It needed his very soul. He felt the cold fingers of despair curl around his heart. This was it. There was no escaping it now. His fingers reached for his rifle, but it wasn't the rifle he needed. It was his soul land that the land had already claimed. Then something unexpected happened. The bones, those twisted skeletons, began to move toward him. Their movements were slow at first, but then faster, more deliberate, as if they had gained a mind of their own. They surrounded him, their hollow eyes locking onto his, their fingers brushing against his skin. The land was not satisfied with feeding the cattle, it wanted him too. And as the bones reached out, something shifted inside him. He could feel the land taking him. He was becoming one with it. The cattle had fed on him, the land had fed on him, and now he was the land. He could feel the whispers inside his head, feel the hunger growing within him, feel the land living inside him, consuming him from the inside out. But just as the darkness seemed to overtake him entirely, something snapped. The cattle stopped. For a moment there was silence. The bones stood still. The whispers faded. Jeremiah looked around, his mind racing. What was happening? Was it over? Was the curse finally satisfied? And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the ground shook. The cattle lowered their heads, their eyes gleaming with a terrifying hunger. The land wasn't finished. It never would be. Jeremiah's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the terrifying truth. The land wasn't just claiming him, it was using him. The hunger wasn't a curse, it was a cycle. And once it had you, it never let go. As Jeremiah's world crumbled around him, he would realize the horrifying truth. Feeding the land wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And soon he would become the very thing he feared most, a land's next sacrifice. Jeremiah stood on the edge of the pasture, his heart pounding as the land seemed to stretch before him, an unyielding dark expanse that would never let him go. The cattle, those monstrous, grotesque creatures, had gathered around him again, their eyes glowing with an intensity that chilled him to his core. They were no longer mere animals, no longer just cattle. They were vessels, conduits for the land's insatiable hunger. And now it was his turn to feed them. The whispers had grown louder in his mind, the voices relentless, insistent, scratching and clawing at his sanity. Feed them, they would say. Give them more. He had fed them once before, and now they demanded more. They always demanded more. The hunger never stopped. He could feel it in the air, in the earth beneath his feet. He could feel the land pulling at him, urging him to feed. The weight of the rifle in his hands felt like the weight of the world. His fingers tightened around it, though his body trembled. The need was unbearable. His thoughts weren't his own anymore. He wasn't just hunting cattle. He wasn't even hunting humans. He was hunting souls. The land had made him its tool, its instrument of consumption. He had no choice anymore. He had become the very thing he feared. The Bonestow's bones had risen too, and they weren't just rising from the earth, they were coming for him. They had become part of the land's dark cycle. The cattle had consumed, but the bones had been left behind. Twisted, gnarled skeletons that moved with a life they should never have had. They weren't just bones, they were something else. And they too were hungry. Jeremiah turned his gaze back to the herd. The air around him seemed to thicken, to grow heavier with each passing second. The cattle were restless, their lowing frantic, desperate. They were hungry. They always were. And now, so was he. The ground trembled beneath his feet. It wasn't the wind or the cattle. No, this was something deeper. It was the land, stirring, living, hungry. The earth was pulling at him, sinking into him, filling him with the cold, suffocating presence that had taken root in his soul. He was part of it now. He could feel it in his veins, in his blood, the way it surged, demanding that he feed them. The whispers echoed in his ears again, louder now, as though the land was speaking directly through them. You will feed them, Jeremiah. It wasn't a question. It was a command. He didn't want to, but he knew he had to. There was no other choice. The land needed him, and the cattle needed him. They were his creation. He had fed them, and now they were more than he had ever imagined. And the hunger was never enough. Jeremiah's legs moved on their own as he walked into the center of the herd. The cattle gathered around him like a mass of shadows, their breath hot and heavy, their bodies monstrous and terrifying. They were hungry, but what they were feeding on wasn't just flesh, it was him, his thoughts, his very existence. The first step he took felt like a step into a grave. He didn't know if it was the hunger driving him or if it was the land, but it didn't matter anymore. He was already lost. The land had claimed him. He stood still as the cattle circled around him, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were feeding, but not just on the flesh. They were feeding on everything. They were feeding on his fear, on his guilt, on the soul of a man who had long since given in to the land's twisted call. Feed them. The whispers returned, louder than ever, like a scream in the back of his mind. He felt his hands move. He didn't even know how they had reached for the rifle. The rifle, the one thing that had brought him here, had forced him to feed, to kill. He raised it slowly, his heart racing, his hands shaking. But he didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, shattering the silence, and the cattle were upon the body before it even hit the ground. They tore into it there, massive jaws ripping flesh from bone. It was quick, brutal, almost animalistic, but it wasn't just the cattle feeding. The land was feeding. He could feel it in his chest, in his throat, in his very soul. The earth beneath him seemed to pulse, vibrating with hunger. The land had tasted blood, and it wanted more. The cycle had started again. The bones twisted, shifting bones began to rise from the dirt around him. Their movements were slow at first, like something waking from a long sleep, but then faster, more deliberate. They weren't just rising. They were becoming something else. The bones were transforming into creature-shifting forms, grotesque and wrong. Jeremiah's stomach turned. He could hear their hollow eyes staring at him. He could feel them moving around him, closing in. The cattle didn't stop feeding. But the bones weren't done. The bones were alive, and they were feeding on him too. His body trembled, his legs unsteady as he realized he wasn't feeding the land anymore. The land was feeding on him. He stumbled back, his eyes wide in terror as the cattle kept devouring the body, tearing it apart with a ravenous hunger that went beyond any earthly need. They weren't eating for sustenance anymore. They were feeding for power, for the land. Jeremiah collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, unable to stop the spiraling panic that clawed at his chest. He could feel the bones shifting around him. The whispers were deafening now. Feed them. They weren't just feeding on the body. They were feeding on his mind, his thoughts. They were claiming him, transforming him into something less than human. And then, the ground cracked. The earth split open beneath him, a chasm forming where there had been solid dirt only moments before. He screamed, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. The land was speaking through him, using him. The cycle was complete. He had become part of it. He was no longer just the feeder, he had become the fed. Jeremiah tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was being pulled, sinking into the earth, the bones, the cattle, all part of the land's hunger. The world around him twisted, warped, and then everything went black. The land had claimed him, body and soul, and now the cycle would continue, pulling in more souls to feed its endless hunger. But what Jeremiah didn't know was that there was a greater force behind it all, something even darker than the land's curse, something that would soon reveal itself to the next victim who wandered too close. The air was thick with a quiet, suffocating tension as the sun began to rise over the horizon. Its light, weak and pale, barely cut through the dark clouds that seemed to have settled over the land. Jeremiah was gone. The land had claimed him, consumed him, and now, in his absence, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were calling for more. The cattle had not slowed their feeding. They were growing larger, stronger, more monstrous. The bones, those twisted, warped, remains of the past, had stopped raising. They had become part of the land. The earth had swallowed them whole, and in return, the land demanded more. And yet, for all the terror that had unfolded over the past weeks, something had begun to shift, something that was not part of the plan. The land had taken what it needed, but it wasn't done. Not yet. Jeremiah had been the first to fall completely into its grip, but now the land was turning its eyes to someone else he knew, wanderer, a man who had unknowingly crossed onto the cursed land. He was a drifter, a man who had lost his way, chasing rumors of a ranch in the distance. He had heard stories, but he didn't believe in them. The stories of cursed lands, of madness and death that consumed the unwary. But now, as he crossed the edge of the pasture, something felt off. The wind didn't move the way it should. The cattle were too still. There was no sound, only the whisper of the land as it began to twist, pulling at him, testing him. This was how it worked. The land would always call, would always feed, and the next victim was already chosen. The drifter, Mark, stopped when he saw the wreckage, the remnants of a body still scattered across the land, bones, flesh. He felt the sickening pressure in his chest, the overwhelming sense that he had arrived at the wrong time. But the land didn't care. It needed him, and he had no idea. Mark took a step forward, looking down at the shattered remains of the man who had been here before him, Jeremiah, or what was left of him. The body had been shredded, the pieces torn apart like paper. But what struck him was the unnatural stillness of it all. The cattle, too, were watching. Their eyes gleamed, locked onto him as he walked through the dirt and bone. He should have turned back. He should have fled when he had the chance, but it was too late. As he knelt by the remains, something moved in the dirt, a bone, shifting slightly, as if it had been disturbed by his presence. His breath hitched. Something wasn't right. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him seemed to breathe, pulling at him, drawing him closer. The whispers had returned, soft at first, then growing louder with each passing second. They weren't coming from the cattle. They weren't coming from anywhere he could place. The voices seemed to seep from the very earth, curling into his thoughts. "Feed them," they whispered. "Feed the land, feed the hunger." Mark stumbled back, his hands trembling. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was something darker, something more ancient. The earth wasn't calling him to survive, it was calling him to feed something far worse than the cattle. The land itself was alive with need, and he was its next victim. Before he could react, the ground shifted beneath his feet. The earth cracked open, wide and jagged, as though the land itself was giving birth. He could hear the bones grinding, moving, coming alive. And then he saw it. A skeletal form rose from the dirt, its bones twisting and reshaping, growing larger and more grotesque with each second. It was one of them, twisted remains of someone who had once lived on this cursed land, now a creature, a vessel for the hunger that had claimed so many before. Mark backed away, his heart racing, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The creature's hollow eyes locked onto his, and then it spoke. "You will feed." Mark froze. The voice was chilling, guttural, but it was the land speaking through it. The creature, it wasn't just a corpse. It was alive, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, more bones began to stir, rising from the dirt, reforming, becoming more than they had ever been before. The earth was pulling at him, consuming him, forcing him toward the twisted skeletons. He could feel his legs giving way, but the pull of the land of the hunger was far too strong. The cattle moved forward, parting as the creatures walked toward Mark. They weren't feeding anymore. They were waiting for him to give them what they needed. Mark tried to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the wind. The cattle circled him, their lowing turning into something like a chant, a rhythmic call that echoed in his mind. The voices' whispers were louder now, their words clawing at his thoughts, consuming him. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. Feed the hunger. The earth began to tremble beneath him. The bones in the ground shifted, moving faster now, growing with terrifying speed, as though the land was birthing them from the very depths of the earth. And then, as if on cue, the herd surged forward. The twisted creatures began to attack, grabbing hold of Mark's limbs, pulling him to the ground. And in that moment, Mark realized what had happened to the man who came before him. He was becoming part of it, part of the land's hunger. His body wasn't his anymore. It was the land's to consume. He tried to fight, to escape, but the creatures were too strong, too many. They weren't just feeding on his flesh, they were feeding on his essence, his very being. The land had claimed him, just as it had claimed Jeremiah, and now he was part of its endless cycle of death and rebirth. The cattle stood back, their eyes cold and unfeeling, watching as the land consumed him. The whispers in Mark's mind grew louder, feeding off his fear, off his terror. And then, as his vision faded, Mark realized that there was no escaping it. The hunger would never stop. It was always hungry, always waiting, always feeding. But Mark wasn't the first and he wouldn't be the last. The land would always need more, and the bones would rise again, waiting for the next victim, the next sacrifice. The sun had long set, casting the land into darkness, save for the pale light of a crescent moon that seemed to do little more than accentuate the shadows. The cattle were restless, their lowing echoing across the plains in unsettling waves. The earth beneath Jeremiah's feet seemed to pulse with life, as though it was alive, breathing, waiting. He could feel it deep in his bones. The land was never satisfied. It was always hungry. Jeremiah's body trembled, but not from the cold. The hunger had shifted inside him. It wasn't just a need for sustenance anymore. It was something darker, something primal. The whispers that had filled his mind for so long were now constant, deafening in their urgency. Feed them, feed the land. But he wasn't feeding them anymore. He was feeding the land. He could feel it. It was in his skin, in his blood. The land had claimed him, and now he was nothing more than an instrument of its insatiable desire. His body was a vessel for the land's hunger, just as the cattle had become, just as the bones had become. He was no longer a man. He was part of something much older, something far darker. His legs carried him toward the herd, but his very soul felt as though it were being pulled in a different direction. The cattle watched him as he approached, their dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They didn't move. They didn't need to. They had already claimed their place, and now the land was coming for him. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a low, almost imperceptible huma whisper just beneath the surface of the air. The cattle shifted, their gaze never leaving him. But something was different. Something in the distance caught his eye. A figurino, shapes emerged from the shadows, moving swiftly toward him. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shapes were human, but not quite. They were gaunt, skeletal, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. And those eyes were hollow, empty, like deep, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. They were not alive in any way that made sense, but they were there, moving toward him. Jeremiah's breath caught in his throat as the realization dawned on him. These were the Watchers, the ones who had been here before, the ones who had fallen to the land's hunger and had been twisted into something other. They were the souls of the land's past victims, bound to it forever, waiting, watching. They stopped just out of reach, standing in a circle around him, their hollow eyes fixed on him with an unblinking, knowing gaze. They weren't just watching, they were waiting for something, waiting for him to feed, just like those before him had. This is it, he thought, his heart hammering in his chest. I'm not just a victim anymore. I'm part of the land. I'm part of the curse. But even as the thought crossed his mind, a new figure appeared in the distance, a shadow moving against the backdrop of the dark sky. Jeremiah's eyes widened as he recognized the figure. It was a man, a traveler, much like he had been, lost and searching for something, anything. The man looked disoriented, his steps slow and unsure, as if he were drawn toward the land, pulled by some unseen force. The cattle were silent now, their eyes trained on the newcomer, as if waiting for his arrival. The land had called him, just as it had called every other victim before him. And now, the cycle was set to continue. Jeremiah tried to move toward the man, to warn him, to scream, but his legs felt like lead. The whispers were growing louder, urging him to do nothing, feed them. The figure of the traveler stepped closer, and as he did, the land seemed to pulse again, the ground shaking beneath Jeremiah's feet. He couldn't stop it. It was happening again. The land had claimed the man just as it had claimed him. He wanted to fight it. He wanted to run. But the land would never let him. It was too late for him. He was one of them now, Watchers, the victims, the cursed. The cattle closed in around the traveler, their monstrous forms emerging from the darkness, their eyes burning like coals. And then, as the traveler stepped into the clearing, the earth cracked open beneath his feet, a deep rumbling crack that echoed through the silence. Jeremiah fell to his knees, his chest tight with fear and helplessness. From the crack, something began to rise, more bones, more twisted, gnarled shapes clawing their way out of the earth. The cattle turned toward the bones, moving as one, their movements too fluid, too synchronized, as if they were no longer mere animals. They were part of the land now, and the land needed them to feed. The traveler screamed, his voice filled with terror, but it was too late. The land had claimed him just as it had claimed so many before. And as the cattle descended upon him, Jeremiah felt the weight of it, the weight of the cycle that would never end. The land had claimed him, and now it was claiming another. Jeremiah could hear the whispers again, louder now, more frantic. Feed them. The ground trembled once more, and as the bones began to pull themselves from the earth, the land spoke to him, its voice deep and terrible, like the rumbling of thunder. You are not alone. You never were. And in that moment, Jeremiah understood. He had become part of the land, part of the hunger. The Watchers, the cattle, the bones were all one. The land had claimed them, and now they would claim more. As the traveler was consumed, as the cattle fed, Jeremiah's mind twisted. The land had claimed him long ago, and now he was nothing but a part of its endless, ravenous cycle. There was no escape. There was no redemption. The land would never stop. And as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, Jeremiah knew the horrifying truth. The land didn't just hunger for flesh, it hungered for souls. But what Jeremiah didn't know was that even the land could not escape the darkness it had created, and the true force behind the curse was only just beginning to reveal itself. The wind howled through the twisted, barren landscape, the dry, cracked earth groaning as if it were alive. Jeremiah's mind was a blur, his body moving on its own, as if the land itself was pulling the strings. The whispers filled his ears, louder than ever, like a symphony of hunger, urging him onward, deeper into the void. The cattle, the bones, the twisted shapes, they were all one. He had become part of the land, just as the land had become part of him. It wasn't just feeding the cattle anymore. It was feeding the land, feeding something that had been here long before him, long before any of the men who had fallen to it. And now, it was time for the land to claim its final toll. Jeremiah stumbled across the dirt, his legs barely holding him up. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind him. A figure, cloaked in shadows, was moving toward him, It wasn't the cattle. It wasn't the twisted remains of those who had come before. This was something else, something darker, something more ancient. The earth beneath his feet rumbled, and a cold sweat dripped down his spine. The shadows flickered and danced as if they were alive, pulling him closer to the edge. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deep guttural growl that seemed to shake the very air around him. He turned, his heart racing, his pulse quickening. The figure in the distance was getting closer. It was no longer a man. It was something far older, something far worse. The land had created it. The figure came into focus. Its face was a mask of bone, jagged and twisted, like the remnants of something that had once been human, but was now something entirely different. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to swallow all light, all life. It wasn't a creature of flesh. It was of the land, and it was here to claim him. Jeremiah tried to move, but his legs felt like stone. He was rooted to the ground, unable to escape the inevitable. He could feel the land pulling him, tightening its grip around his soul. The creature, the guardian of the land, approached him slowly, each step shaking the earth beneath them. The land had always been hungry. It had always needed to feed, to consume. But this creature, this was something else. This was the true hunger, the hunger that had created the land, the hunger that had driven everything to feed. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, like the teeth of something ancient, something from the depths of the earth. Its voice, if it could even be called a voice, was like the sound of the ground cracking open, like thunder rolling across the sky. "You were chosen," it rasped. "You were always meant to feed." Jeremiah's mind spun, his thoughts breaking apart at the edges. He had fed the cattle, fed the land, fed the bones, but it was never enough. The hunger had only grown stronger, and now, standing before him, was the source of it all, the one who had created the curse, the one who had called the land into being. "You are no longer a man," the creature continued. "You are part of it, the land, the hunger, the cycle. You are one with it now, and there is no escape." Jeremiah's eyes widened, the weight of the creature's words sinking in. There was no escape. The land had consumed him. He had become one with the hunger. His soul was no longer his own. And now, the land was calling to him, urging him to feed again, to continue the cycle. The whispers had returned, but they weren't whispers anymore. They were commands. "Feed them," the land demanded. "Feed them all." Jeremiah opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The earth beneath him began to crack and split, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The cattle were closing in again, their monstrous forms surrounding him, their eyes cold and unfeeling. The bones, twisted and broken, began to shift once more, rising from the earth like soldiers summoned to war. The creature, the guardian, wasn't just watching him anymore. It was part of the land, part of the hunger, and it wanted him to feed. Jeremiah fell to his knees, his body racked with pain, his soul splitting in two. The land was consuming him. It had always been consuming him. From the moment he stepped onto this cursed land, he had been a part of it. He had been feeding it, feeding its endless hunger, until there was nothing left of him. The guardian moved closer, its cold hand reaching for Jeremiah's chest. It was pulling him into the land, into the cycle of death and rebirth. The hunger was too great. The land needed him. It needed his soul. And then, in the final moments of his awareness, Jeremiah understood. He wasn't the first. He wasn't the last. The land had claimed them all, and it would claim more. As the guardian's hand closed around his heart, the earth beneath him trembled, and the land fed. The cycle had started again. The hunger would never stop, and the whispers, they would never be silenced. The land had claimed another soul, and the hunger would continue, relentless and eternal, as the cycle of death, rebirth, and consumption spiraled out of control. But the true horror was still hidden beneath the surface. Something darker, more ancient, was waiting to be revealed. The land was quiet now. The cattle had finished their feast, the bones scattered across the earth like the remnants of a world long forgotten. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light reflecting off the blood-soaked earth. The whispers had stopped, for now the land was still. But it wasn't over. It had never been over. Jeremiah was gone. The land had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. His body was no longer his. It was part of the earth now, a part of the hunger, a part of the endless cycle that would never stop. His soul was no longer his own. It belonged to the land, to the curse that had started long before him and would continue long after him. The guardian, if it could even be called that, stood in the distance, watching. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a creature. It was a force, an ancient being that had existed before the land itself. And now it was waiting for the next soul to feed the land. The earth trembled beneath the surface. The bones shifted, their movements slow, deliberate. They weren't just bones, they were a part of the land. Now, a part of the hunger that drove it. And they too were waiting for more. The land had always been hungry, always needing more to feed its insatiable desire. It didn't matter who came, what they had to offer. The hunger was endless. It would never be satisfied. And now, the next victim had arrived. He didn't know it yet. He didn't know the curse that awaited him, but he would. The traveler appeared from the shadows, stepping into the clearing where Jeremiah had fallen. He was young, his clothes torn and weathered from days of travel, his face streaked with dirt. He didn't see the land, not yet. He didn't hear the whispers, didn't feel the pulse beneath his feet. He was just another wanderer, lost in the wilderness, searching for something that could never be found. He stepped closer to the herd, his eyes wide with wonder. They had been grazing quiet, docile, but now they were still, watching him. Their eyes gleamed with that same unnerving hunger, but the traveler was unaware. The land had chosen him. The cycle would continue. As he walked further into the clearing, he felt a chill. It was subtle at first, just a slight breeze, but it grew colder with every step. The cattle moved, their bodies shifting as though they were closing in on him. The traveler stopped, looking around. Something didn't feel right. The air felt thick, oppressive, and then he heard it, whispers. Feed them. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The whispers were soft at first, but they grew louder, more demanding, until they were deafening. He couldn't make sense of them, but he could feel them, scraping at his mind, clawing at his thoughts. Feed them. His breath quickened. The cattle were closing in now, surrounding him, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. The traveler's legs buckled beneath him as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The land was everywhere, pulling at him, suffocating him. And then he saw its figure in the distance, the guardian. The figure was waiting, its hollow eyes locked onto him, its form twisting in the darkness. The air seemed to crackle with energy as the land itself began to stir, its hunger rising once again. The traveler turned to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The whispers, the cattle, the land, it was all consuming him. He could feel the earth pulling at him, dragging him toward the cycle. He wasn't just a victim, it was a part of the land's hunger now. And then, the earth cracked beneath his feet. The traveler screamed as he fell into the chasm that had opened in the ground, the darkness swallowing him whole. But before he could hit the bottom, the land claimed him, and the cycle began again. The cattle moved in, their eyes burning with hunger. The land fed once more. The figure of the guardian stood in the distance, its gaze unwavering. It was the land, the hunger, the curse that had existed long before any man had set foot on it. The cycle would never end. It had always been this way. The land would always need more. It would always claim more. As the cattle fed, the bones that had once been part of men rose again, twisting and shifting beneath the earth. The land was never done. The hunger would never stop. And the whispers, they were always there, waiting. They would always call to the next victim, the next soul. They would feed the hunger, and the cycle would continue. Jeremiah had been the first to fall, but he would not be the last. Final payoff, Jeremiah, the cattle, the bones known of them were truly gone. The land had claimed them all, and it would never let go. The hunger, insatiable and eternal, pulsed through the earth, feeding off every soul foolish enough to wander too close. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in the wind, calling out to the next victim, the next soul to be consumed. The cycle would repeat. It always did. The land fed on their fear, their desperation, their very essence. The hunger would never be satisfied. The bones, twisted and gnarled, would rise again. The cattle, monstrous and endless, would continue to feed. Jeremiah had become part of the land, just like those before him. But the true horror lay in the knowledge that the cycle would never end. The land would always need more, and it would always find a way to claim those who dared to listen. The whispers would always call.